I quit WoW is something of a meme in the WoW community. It feels like every other day there's some post on forums, Reddit, or God forbid a YouTube video about people quitting WoW. At times it's even overbearing, with the discussion amongst these communities being entirely centered around people leaving WoW. It gets even worse when some new MMO comes out that's been hyped up for months, apparently, and that this time this will be the game to finally kill WoW and wake Blizzard up from their slumber or something like that, and finally we'll have a new great MMO that's on par with the WoW of old. The reality is that there has probably been more WoW killers than WoW has expansions at this point, and none of them have even become close to dethroning WoW, forget even reaching its peak. All that to say that when it comes to people quitting WoW, well, that happens every day. Hell, WoW even recently lost one of the biggest drops in player count ever. Regardless, despite this huge drop in players, it was something like 6 million, WoW isn't dead. Still there chugging along as if nothing really happened. That's partly why it's such a meme in the community. Seriously, people quit WoW every day. It's nowhere near a rare occurrence. But the other part of why that's a meme is because people who quit WoW are often back not long so after they make a declaration in trade chat ranting and raving about how WoW sucks now and usually loudly declaring that they are done with the game for good. Then a week or a month passes and oh, there they are, back online with their tail between their legs, acting like they didn't just threaten to kill half the guild because they didn't get a mount drop. All this to say that whenever you see a video or post about someone quitting WoW, it's either completely expected by the community, or it's just not taken seriously at all. I mean, that's why it's a meme, because it happens so often. Listening to the same old tired and worn out ranting about how WoW sucks, blah 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 blah, happens so often that it may as well be its own tired overused genre with its own TV tropes page. It's overdone, it's bloated, and every idiot with an opinion seems to do it. Anyway, here's why I quit World of Warcraft. WoW is a game about content, sure. Gear's important, mythic rating, PvP rating, classes, all of that stuff falls under the ubiquitous blanket term of content. It is vastly important that WoW has a constant stream of content. It, for all intents and purposes, is the first live service game to really become popular on the scale of something like Fortnite. Now, I need to mention this because I have some complaints, as most people do, about WoW. If you play WoW, you also probably bare minimum have an hour-long rant in your pocket about something stupid in this game. The goal of this video is not to just complain about the stuff that's in the game currently, or at all what's in the game currently, really, because there's nothing that as someone who doesn't raid and as someone who doesn't PvP that I really need to complain about that much. I mean, the leveling is kinda too fast, maybe. I guess the only complaint I really have is that weird tutorial area that they have new players use. It's bad, and it just really does a bad job of explaining the game, especially since it just drops you off into the old World of Warcraft like nothing happened. Like, it'd be fine if it led to a bigger tutorial area, but it just doesn't, and it just kind of leaves you to your own devices. Outside of that, there's nothing really that I, a player returning on a fresh account after a long time, can really complain about content-wise. However, this video is about why I quit WoW forever a long time ago, and it all revolves around a lack of content, which for pretty much every other live service game is a death sentence. Long before we had the Master Manipulator from the Blue Man Group, and long before we had Corpse Queen and her self-insert simp, we had the WoW community's biggest threat. Calamity unlike any other. One that would shake our very foundations and destroy the world we love forever, or at least parts of it. If this video was made at the end of Mist of Pandaria, the words I would have uttered next would have been World of Warcraft Cataclysm. But it's not 2013, my friends. A decade later, there is one expansion that stands above the rest. One expansion whose name you've probably already guessed. WoD is very interesting to talk about nowadays. The content that does exist for WoD is good, but that's the caveat, isn't it? Because Blizzard made one of the worst mistakes any game dev of a popular game like WoW could ever do. Before we get into this, since this is ostensibly a video about why I quit WoW, we need to talk about the setup for this expansion story-wise, because for me, this is something that I care about the most. Anyway, the Panda people in a cutscene told the leaders of the Alliance and Horde that they had suffered the most at the hands of Garrosh, and that they should be the ones to enact justice, which is probably one of the worst tropes in media. I mean, for one thing, keeping a villain alive after you killed probably thousands of people to get to him is just dumb. More than that, suffering isn't something that you can measure. Who has suffered the most in this instance is a bit of a crazy statement to make. It's not like they were counting bodies or anything. Regardless of this stupidity, the Horde and Alliance leaders go along with this because they too were tired of the Shadow Pan and their BS and wanted to move on to the other expansion. And with that, Garrosh was sent to prison. Meanwhile, Raffion, the last uncorrupted Black Dragonflight member until Dragonflight, or that guy from Outlands in there, I literally forgot to say. Anyway, the last uncorrupted Black Dragonflight member at this time, who we rescued as an egg literally last expansion, is seeing things, and those things happen to be a future Legion invasion, which, spoilers, happens directly after Warlords of Draenor, but you probably knew that. Because of this, Raffion and his supporters, which he gained somehow, one of whom is a bronze Dragonflight member, which again isn't really explained, somehow know that there is an alternate dimension with an alternate Draenor in it. But they decide, because of this upcoming Legion invasion, that the best plan of action is to unite the Horde on this alternate Draenor and create an army on par with the Legion. So naturally, the best option for this plan is to break Garrosh Hellscream out of prison and then send him back in time and unite the Horde of old under Garrosh's command. The plan, as you can imagine, backfires immediately, and Garrosh kills the Bronze Dragon and turns the Horde into the Iron Horde. I brought this up for a reason, because again, this video is why I personally quit the game, and for me, personally, just my opinion, the story for WoD, not all that great. Kind of sucks in a lot of places, especially in this portion of it. It's just pointless. Like, this entire thing could have just been avoided if we did what we do to most WoW villains and just killed Garrosh. More than that, this entire expansion, in my opinion, completely shits all over the orcs and their history. In our timeline, the orcs did not start out as all of them being a unified warlike race of raiding tribals. Did they do that a lot? Sure. Originally, yes, absolutely. They weren't peaceful by any means, but they weren't monsters either. And their story was one of a group of seemingly honorable warriors being tricked into murdering the Draenei and entering a war with them, and then on the eve of their final victory, taking the demon blood which transformed them again into literal monsters. Before the Legion's interference, the orcs probably would have never gone at war with the Draenei, or have done any of the horrors afterwards, like something like the Path of Glory, for example. Were they a perfect people? No, of course not. But they and their actions weren't all that different from what other races have done in WoW. Like, the humans and the elves did a ton of fucked up shit to the trolls, and it's not like the night elves were perfect people either. The entire premise of WoD was, what if the orcs didn't drink the demon blood? What would become of them as a people? And apparently the answer is that they would do the exact same shit that they did anyway. However, there are other problems for this setup to the story. For one thing, the old Horde was far from a unified force in their goals or motivations. I mean, the original war chief got murdered by his second in command. Just because the Horde was united in invading Azeroth, and specifically just the human kingdoms really, does not mean that they were all getting along just fine. It also doesn't help that there was so much Legion interference and infiltration just to even make the Horde. Like, there would be no one you could trust in this new army to defeat the Legion. Legion aside, the old Horde, the ones that originally invaded Azeroth, lost. Like, they lost badly enough for them to get pushed all the way back to their original planet, and then that planet exploded. It's no exaggeration to say that choosing the Horde of Old as his fighting force on par with the Legion is like the dumbest statement possible. Like, they lost to the Old Alliance already. And yeah, sure, the Old Alliance of Lordaeron was way more powerful than current alliances, but not by much. More than that, the Old Horde only really beat Stormwind, which, while arguably was the most powerful kingdom, was completely alone and isolated, and their biggest asset was Medivh, who was a traitor who allowed the Horde to cross into Hazelroth in the first place. It also wasn't like the Old Horde was just made up of orcs either. They had trolls, ogres, goblins, demons, dragons, and undead. Oh, and a literal another human kingdom helping them out. And they still lost. It makes no sense to even bother with this stuff when you could have just told the leaders of both factions that the Legion was coming, especially if your other goal was to unite both of them. Wrathion, you're an uncorrupted dragon, they would probably listen to you. It's also not like the leadership of either side is like so crazy either. Like, it was Varian in charge of the Alliance this time around in Vol'jin. They probably would have fucking believed you. As for the Iron Horde as a threat itself, all I can say is, I think the Scarlet Crusade was a bigger threat than the Iron Horde. They were just a bunch of pushovers. This whole expansion could have been a Caverns of Time raid. Oh, and all the Magyar players apparently come from this AU Draenor, but that would mean that they aren't Magyar orcs. They would just call themselves regular orcs, because the Magyar means uncorrupted. They're the ones left who live in Outland who didn't drink the demon blood in our timeline. But the majority of orcs in the alternate Draenor didn't drink the demon blood, so there would be no point in calling themselves uncorrupted. I mean, that was the entire point of the expansion, right? They would just be called regular orcs. It would be like if there was an alternate timeline where the Scourge didn't exist, and all of the humans from that timeline were called living humans. But, you know, they'd just be humans, right? You see what I mean? Like, it doesn't make much sense. It's all these little things that add up over time, you know, and really bring down not only the story of this expansion, but its lasting legacy as a whole. Now, the story of WoD was a big reason why I quit, because I just couldn't bring myself to care about what was happening, lore-wise at least. And honestly, that's a shame, because after looking back on the WoD story later, it's nowhere near as bad as I thought it was. I mean, sure, the premise was dumb as hell, but the actual events of the expansion were honestly pretty good, and they had a lot of depth and emotion to them and weight, and it's really a shame that I just didn't care enough to actually get into it as much as I should have. However, the story is not as relevant in WoW as you may think, especially in a game like it. I think you can fundamentally have a bad story in WoW and for that game to still be good. Because at the end of the day, how many people are actually reading all the quest text and its underlying themes? It's not a lot, but if the content you have is fun to play and there's a lot of it, then a bad story can be brushed aside easily, especially if you can take your mind off just how bad the story is. But what happens when you don't have any content at all in your expansion? What happens then when your players are forced to think about all the dumb stuff that exists within your game? Well, I think you know what the end result was. Hey, do you want an expansion where the major features are a selfie stick, Twitter integration, and Facebook games turned into actual mechanics? What? Story, raids, classes, professions, PvP, and exploration? Why would you need that in World of Warcraft? I mean, isn't it great that there's nothing to do but farm gold in your garrison for 2 entire years? That sounds like the World of Warcraft I know and love. Being serious, WoD had a lot of fantastic content in it. Like, no joke, WoD may have some of my favorite looking zones, for example, in it, and the questing is really fun and immersive. And as I mentioned earlier, many people were fond of the raiding as well. But I made an analogy in another draft for this video that I'm going to steal from that, and I think this sums up what WoD was actually like to play like in the day, at least for me. I like pizza, right? I mean, who doesn't? You know, with its pepperoni and its cheese, whatever, right? Whatever you put on pizza. And I like the show Breaking Bad. I love to watch it. It's great. You know, it's fun. But if I had to eat one type of pizza every day and watch Breaking Bad every day, I'd get tired of it pretty quickly. especially since for Draenor's case, it would be more like eating a single slice of pizza every day and watching a summary of Breaking Bad on YouTube for hours and hours on end. There was a lot of build-up for Warlords of Draenor, but the story we got, there was so little of that there was seemingly more time spent on the hype build-up to this game than there was on the actual content in it itself. I think we learned more about the villains of this expansion through these Lord of War cinematics than we did actually meeting them in the game. Oh, and outside of the story, WoD only had 2 raid tiers, which, to put that into perspective, Wrath, which is often considered the best, had like 4 raid tiers, which is double the amount. So to go from Wrath having this amount of content to 2 expansions later having barely enough for 2 is insane. It's crazy, and it's unacceptable. And this is for one main reason, because a lot of the development time went to a certain feature that you probably don't remember today. Oh boy. Okay, so garrisons were Blizzard's, or let's be real, probably Activision's way of introducing the very successful, let's call it, mobile AFK game into World of Warcraft. Basically, you have a game, or in this case a garrison, that you optimize your needs to and that goes on in the background, essentially while you do other things. This garrison also served as your main hub in this expansion. Each one has one. In Dragonflight, it's Valdragon, which is a problem, for one thing, because even back in Cata, there were complaints and concerns about the community dying, especially on my server. So, to have a feature that totally isolated you from the rest of the players just made the whole thing like 10 times worse. More than that, garrisons completely circumvented having to even play the game, really, because you could just buy or acquire anything you needed without even leaving the garrison and actually exploring the beautiful world that they created. It especially didn't help that WoW now had a reputation of being extremely easy now and was basically a cakewalk for the older players. Furthermore, garrisons again were the main feature of this expansion, like dragon riding is in Dragonflight. However, garrisons also exacerbated the lack of content in WoD, because there was almost no need to leave your garrison, as I mentioned. You didn't have to mine or gather herbs like I said, so why would you? Why would you go explore the world? Same with gear. If you can gain gear by not doing anything and just relaxing, then why would you do that? Why would you raid? Sure, the raids are fun, but if you don't like raiding before or you haven't raided before, then the garrisons incentivized you to not engage with this mode of content at all, which again cuts you off from a huge part of the core gameplay of WoW. And because there was so little content already, this made this content drought way worse. When you started WoD, like during the beginning expansion, there was about a month's worth of content to do, which would be fine if there was something to actually come along in the content pipeline that was worth it. There was almost nothing added at all to the game. And here's the typical day of someone who didn't raid or PvP. Here's what it was. You log on, you collect your gold, and you get your rewards for missions, and you reset all those for the next day. Then you accept a daily to go like kill some mobs or something, and maybe that takes like 10 minutes. Then you collect the resources from your garrison, and then that was it. That was the in-game content loop for WoD if you didn't PvP or raid. At most, you could get like an hour out of that. You got about a month of doing the good questing and leveling your alts, and outside of that, that was the gameplay loop. There was nothing else. It was so fucking miserable. It was fucking bleak. Seriously. Remember earlier when I mentioned Twitter integration and a selfie stick being major patch changes? That wasn't a joke. Patch 6.1 was the first major patch of WoD, and generally how it goes, a major patch will be when most of the content comes. Generally, there's some differences here or there, and there is a debate on what is actually major content and what isn't. Generally, there's like 3 to 4 major content patches each expansion. Patch 6.1 was the first major patch of WoD. In Legion 7.1, they added Return to Karazhan and 2 raids as its headline features, as well as other changes and additions to the game's story. 6.1 added, and this is real, an Heirlooms tab, updated Blood Elf models, garrison quality of life changes, and Twitter integration. Which, in case you were unaware, just meant that your Twitter account would tweet out when you got a rare item or higher, or if you took a screenshot. Speaking of screenshots, this is also when they added the selfie camera, which, in case you're somehow unaware, is an added feature that took real development time. And you may be like, why are you saying that? And that's because you could always take a selfie in WoW. Like you could always do that. It's always been possible to see the front of your character, turn off your HUD, turn around, and then take a picture practically wherever you wanted to. And if you wanted to add a filter to all of that for some reason, you could just put it in like Photoshop or something. Oh, and in this patch, you're never going to believe this. Huge continent changes, world changing. Nagrand got 2 mailboxes. Incredible job, guys. This patch, by the way, was released about 2.5 months after WoD's initial release date. Remember how I said that there was about a month's worth of content? By the time the first major patch hit, people were already tired of the same stuff and had already done everything. And this being the first major patch that didn't even add anything new was a slap in the face to the player base, and a lot of people quit because of it. I said earlier that Blizzard's biggest mistake was giving up on the expansion, because it was. The content that exists in Warlords of Draenor is objectively some of the best we've ever gotten in WoW, and there's a reason I haven't really described it, because if you have never experienced it, you should try it. It's some of the best questing and some of the best raids, and the zones in particular look good. There just wasn't enough of it. Right now, I'm gonna list off some of the content that was promised to us that never got added to WoD. Horde and Alliance hub cities, Raid of Shatrath, an ogre continent, Sangermarsh, 4 scrapped battlegrounds, removed islands, having garrisons be all over the map and be able to build those all over the map, numerous cut quests, class accessories, the entirety of tier 3 raiding, something called scenarios, both normal and heroic. This wasn't really talked about, but I figured probably would have something to do with world questing just based on the name. The train system that would have taken you around Draenor because there wasn't any player flying until a year after the game came out, a tabard collection system, and more. But isn't like all the stuff I mentioned here was just stuff that was put on a whiteboard, and like, you know, the thing that they do in cinematics and WoW where they'll be like 10 new dance emotes coming in Wrath, and then they just never released those? It wasn't like that. These were legitimate features talked about on panels and stuff. A lot of this stuff had significant development time put into it. It wasn't like Blizzard was just sitting on their hands the entire time. They spent a significant amount of time and resources into this content, into things that they ultimately either couldn't finish in time or they just cut because they moved on to Legion's development. Now, I neglected to mention earlier that between Mist and WoD, there was a significant amount of real time where there was no major content added to the game. In fact, the wait was over a year. Siege of Ogremore, the last major update of Mist of Pandaria, the next patch was 399 days later, and as mentioned earlier, 6.1 was a fucking joke, which means that basically after the release, they had to wait practically another 200 days after doing their month's worth of content to get actual more fucking content. And then after that, they got nothing, because the next major patch for WoD took 392 days to release. That means that there's about 2 years worth of WoW where Blizzard released no major new content in this time frame at all, and they left the game to rot. If there had been anything substantial enough released during this time frame, it would have done a lot for the game and the community, but the fact is that it didn't happen. I quit WoD at some point soon-ish after launch. You know, WoW brain, maybe soon was like 6 months after, but you get the point, right? I don't remember when or how. I just know that I just didn't want to play for this expansion anymore. I told myself that I'd come back to it and play it again after something substantial had happened, or something had even piqued my interest. After all, it's still WoW. So anyway, the next time I played the game was in Legion, and I got the Ashbringer for my paladin that I used to play every day, and I always dreamed of having one day. I mean, it's the fucking Ashbringer. I mean, I even switched specs to get it, but Legion never really captured me, and after I got that stupid Rhino helmet that was leveling gear, I just stopped playing. I came back again during BFA and Classics release, and those were fun for about a week, and then I moved on again. And now I'm back again, back to Dragonflight, and I'm having more fun than I've had in a long time of World of Warcraft. There's just something about Dragonflight, I think, that harkens back to what I really enjoyed doing in WoW, which was just exploring the world and seeing all the mysteries it had to offer. It's very nostalgic in a way for me, and the Seal of Aspect reminds me a lot of Wormrose Temple, for example, for obvious reasons. You know what I mean. I don't know. It's just nice. It's fun to play, which makes me even more angrier for what WoD could have been. Because think about all the stuff that I mentioned for just a second that got cut, the zones, for example, and then add that to what we actually got in the game. Sure, there still would have been core gameplay issues with garrisons, for example, and like no talent trees. That was a big issue during this time, and the game was just easier to play. But there still would have been a lot of content to mitigate all that noise. There is an argument, I think, to be made that potentially WoD could have been, if not been, the best expansion probably ever, but it just wasn't. Originally, this video was going to be called something else, and it was going to be about something else entirely. This video would have been called I Miss the World of Warcraft, which would have done numbers during the pandemic, let me tell you. But the reason why I wanted to make a video was because the last memories I have of Warlords of Draenor are not great. And for some reason, I think a part of me even recently believed that was because the world that I began to love and grew up with was just no longer good. It was terrible. And that's not true, because I really do love Draenor and its environments, and the music, man, the music is so wonderful, and it really makes leveling the WoD zone so much better. I think what WoD really solidified to me at the time was that the server that I was on, the one that I had grown up with, essentially, and has so many memories on, was finally dead. My dad did not seriously start playing WoW until Burning Crusade, and the server that he settled on was called Misha. It was the server where I had so many memories and met so many people, and it was just a wonderful place. Last time I saw another person on that server that wasn't from Rexxar, the server it merged with, was just after Warlords of Draenor came out. In my subsequent comebacks to the game, I have never seen another player from Misha, ever, and I've hardly ever seen any from Rexxar either. It's partly why I'm on a new account on a completely different server, because Misha and Rexxar are dead. They were dying well before WoD, but to me, that expansion was the final nail in the coffin. That is why WoD was Blizzard's worst mistake. WoD, Blizzard had an opportunity to fix sort of the bleed which was happening from World of Warcraft and subscribers and the death of communities and guilds and so on and so forth. But they didn't do that, and with their gameplay design, they encouraged isolation and not interacting with the community that made WoW so special in the first place, which forced the communities that had existed for a decade at that point to wither away and die, never to return. That's why Warlords of Draenor was one of the worst expansions, and it's why I quit WoW originally all those years ago. Today, if WoWRealmPop.com is accurate, there is a total of 468 active characters still playing on Misha. And if you're being really fudgy with your numbers, that means that at a minimum, Misha has a total of 10 people on it. 10 people. From a server where I saw great battles over Goldshire and Lordaeron, and in the other cities, seeing entire guilds disappear overnight before my eyes because of arguments and trade chat, and watching my old guild my dad was a part of slowly grow smaller and smaller until me and him took it over and counted down the days until we could finally take full control of it, to watching legions of PvPers show off their skills and their armor in innumerable amounts of duels in Goldshire and all over the world, to seeing 5 people in Stormwind when I came during BFA, in a city that once was so overflowing at times I couldn't even get to the mailbox during its peak. From a server where it was so common for my dad to get all of his mining nodes and plants and herbs stolen right from under his nose because there were so many people farming it, to a server that just barely has enough people for a 10-man raid. I don't think anything could have really saved my server from the result that it got. It was already dying by cataclysm at that point, and listen, even I'm not stupid enough or naive enough to think that there's some magical fix to every problem in the world. But Blizzard didn't even try. They just gave up. Sure, they merged servers, but they didn't prevent the things that caused people to leave in the first place. Instead, they doubled down, and they just didn't do anything. Instead of continuing on with WoD, and instead of making the expansion that they should have, they just didn't. They stopped because it was too hard and because they got in over their heads. And they moved on to Legion instead. This is why WoD was the biggest mistake in WoW's history. Because it didn't kill the game, far from it. But it did kill what WoW used to be. And it has never recovered from that. But hey, I guess it was all worth it in the end, right? We got updated character models.